Good morning. No, good afternoon, everybody. My name is Tim Schultz, and I'm from Business for South Africa, and I will be moderating this webcast on localization. By now, I'm sure everybody is familiar with Zoom, so that's the platform we are using. May I ask that everyone please mute? We will try and do that centrally, mute your microphones, and also turn off your cameras. That will improve the bandwidth for everybody. Today, we will explore how in just a few short months, South Africa created a local PPE and equipment manufacturing industry out of almost nothing. We did it in the midst of the greatest global health crisis of our generation, and we did it through what we are calling radical collaboration. We have assembled a panel of these radical collaborators, and as you can see on the right-hand side, all of them are young tearaways. And they will tell you more about what we did, how we did it, and what we must do next. So let me welcome Tebogo Makube from the DTIC, Tony Ehrenreich of COSATU, and Ross Boyd, who headed up the innovation stream of B4SA. We only have an hour, and we have a lot to get through. So we are going to give each of the speakers a chance to say a few words, and they each have a slide, giving their key impressions of what we have achieved over the last few months. We will then have a short moderated panel discussion, followed by an audience Q&A for about half an hour before we close. As we are all on Zoom, you will be able to put your questions into the chat box. So please have a discussion, ask your questions as we progress. And when we get to the Q&A session, we will do our best to respond to those questions. That, I think, is all we need to know in terms of how we are going to run the show. Let's start back in March 2020. When COVID struck South Africa, only 8% of our medical equipment, including PPE, was produced locally. Almost everything was imported. With global supply chains clogged and prices skyrocketing, we had to make a plan as local shortages risked thousands of lives and then millions of livelihoods. What is not well known is that back then, every country in the world was competing for the same dwindling stocks of PPE. It was quite literally a lawless Wild West, or Wild East as it turned out to be. Orders weren't fulfilled, planes and cargoes were diverted, containers would arrive in Addis Ababa or Johannesburg that we had ordered, and they would be half empty or with the wrong spec PPE. And the whole process was delayed. And even though we had money to throw at it, the global supply chain didn't match up to our need, and in fact, it didn't match up to almost everybody's need. And this caused a reevaluation of what a global supply chain could mean and what a local supply chain could mean. So where did that leave us? It meant we had 60 million people needing basic PPE with a high demand for medical equipment that we couldn't meet locally. 92% of our medical supplies were imported. Costs rose dramatically. And when we tried to deal with how we would respond, we didn't know the manufacturing capacity or requirements in South Africa. We didn't know the types of masks or specific medical equipment that we needed for managing this disease. There was no centralized coordination of existing medical manufacturing capacity. And yet, the pandemic was taking hold. Our frontline health workers did not have enough PPE, and of course you saw the results of that with skyrocketing infection rates in hospitals, which prevented, of course, effective care as more and more nurses and doctors came down with the disease. This harmed both the healthcare and it also cost us lives. And then when we looked at how we as a country dealt with this, it prevented us restarting the economy after the hard lockdown, what made it far more difficult because we didn't have the PPE that would allow us to mitigate our risks. But through radical collaboration, within just a few months, we birthed 54 procurement-ready local PPE manufacturers, compliant with the international standards and able to create and support hundreds of jobs. This proves that localization can work and should work. Let me now hand over to Tebogo Makube from the DTIC to tell you more.
Thank you very much, Tim. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Sorry, my name is Tebogo Makube from the DTIC. I'm responsible for the implementation of the local content policy in government, general, including state-owned companies, as well as the management of the National Industrial Participation Program, which is an offset, the procurement offset program when we buy imported products to the value of $10 million US. As government, we have a policy of implementing an offset program to limit the impact of those imports. But for today, the session is about what did we do, to deal with the impact of the COVID-19 in the South African economy. Yes, it was a tough job, still a tough job. We can't say we have 100% made it. We must remember that economically, before COVID hit us, South Africa was in a technical recession. All right, so we're not in a good position. Looking at the numbers in manufacturing, the manufacturing sector contracted by 50%, year on year. So it shows that the economy was in a very bad situation at that time. So COVID made it worse. All right. So as you know that, if we are being hit by a crisis, it's either you give up or you stand up. So using the South African style, which we have learned over the years, that when we are being hit by a crisis, we have to come together. All right. And business, government, labor, and social partners came together and created a partnership, manufactured products, mainly personal protective equipment. So business for South Africa, NEDLEC, government departments were all rallied around, including labor, say, what do we do? Because we can't rely on imports per se, even though that imports are important in certain sectors, but local production is the one that is going to propel this economy moving forward. So through that, we worked through the period, structures were created, a local manufacturing partnership was created, which what was required at that time. Can say that there was information asymmetry in terms of matching demand and supply. So part of the work that was done was to look at the data, because we can't make good decisions without data. Demand and supply data, where we were lacking, what kind of support that was needed in terms of material, in terms of testing, standards. So all that was done. Institutions were brought in, regulatory institutions dealing with technical standards, dealing with standardization, the health products, certification, all of them were brought in, making sure that, remember, if you deal with health products, it's not only about production, it's also about certification of health products. It's also about making sure that what is being supplied, what is being procured, complies with international standards, because you can't risk the lives of the people. So that was done and is still continuing. We are still meeting twice per month to look at the numbers, even though the demand for PPE in some certain products is scaling down. It is important that we continue, we support the local manufacturers, not only for the South African market, but also for exports. Africa presents an opportunity for these products. So we don't want other countries just coming and dumping them in in the African market. So we as a country play a role in making sure that we export those products to the African markets. The African Union has taken a decision that South Africa should be a centerpiece in making sure that we export those products. We have learned a lot. Our view is that this can be replicated in other sectors of the economy, not only PPE related sectors, but we're having challenges, as I've said, economically. And this experience that we have learned, it is our view that we scale it up in other sectors of the economy. Thank you very much. I will now hand over to Tony.
Thank you very much, Tebogo, and good afternoon to everybody. My name is Tony Ehrenreich. I'm with the Congress of South African Trade Unions. And what I briefly want to speak to is our impressions on the ecosystem that's required for our effective response to the challenges that had emerged both from COVID, but also more generally, given the state of our economy at the outbreak of COVID. I want to start, Chairperson, by saying that the institution that in part facilitated the engagement that was essential to the economic partnerships is a replication of what happens at NEDLAC. At NEDLAC, we have the most senior representatives from business, labor, and government engaging in social partnerships to find responses to the challenges that confront us as a society and to make sure that we're able to put in place comprehensive solutions that respond to these. Now, it's that premier partnership in South Africa, that principle that was established there, that was then extended into the interventions in respect of COVID. Here, what we effectively saw coming about is a sense of South Africa Incorporated responding jointly to the challenge of COVID, but mindful that it happens in a particular context of industrialization, economic stagnation in South Africa, and our ability to respond to that as effectively as possible. The example that I want to use to illustrate this partnership and this ongoing development that had led to comprehensive solutions in many areas, and this is in addition to what my colleagues will be specifically referring to, is what had happened at the UIF TERS, when business, labor, and government came together to ensure that we set up a facility and a fund that can both compensate workers who are unable to present themselves to employment as a result of the lockdown. But in addition to compensating workers for the loss of income during the lockdown, we also had to find a way of ensuring that we stop businesses from closing down during the lockdown period, or where they are forced into retrenchments because of the economic conditions that had been consequential to the lockdown. So those were the purposes that we brought together the different institutions and the different capacity to respond to that. What was it that we had to do? Well, one of the first things that had to be done in the UIF was to build new capacity to be able to administer the payment of the UIF benefits to people who were affected by the lockdown, who could not report for work or in the same format that they reported before. Now, out of that new capacity, what we had is that there was voluntary support and contributions from many of the social partners. And so here business and labor had put forward volunteers that both served on the committees, but also brought in technical experiences and capacity to make sure that we were able to address many of the challenges thrown up by COVID and the implications for the UIF. We know by now that more than 50 billion rand had been put into the economy as a direct result of these UIF packages. And this was probably the most significant stimulus into the economy during a period of lockdown, when essentially demand in many areas had taken a significant blow in respect of driving economic demand and the capacity to supply those. So in large extent, there were many positive developments that had come out of the UIF mechanism. And given the fact that it was a new system and there were many challenges that had to be overcome, we know that even now there are still measures that we need to find a way to respond to more effectively where there are claims outstanding. We know that some of the additional issues that have been thrown up during this period is nearly the South African curse in many respects, where corrupt individuals find an opportunity or a moment to be able to ply their trade, even in the most desperate of circumstances in South Africa. So what we've got to do out of that is, besides building the systemic ability to stop these corrupt practices, we've got to make a call on businesses and individuals to react more ethically and to make sure that their conduct is a reflection of the private virtues that we want to hold up as a society. And so we've got to ensure that we stop the instances of corruption by many companies who filed false claims. We've also got to stop the corruption in the departments, because already there's been identified some instances where individuals within the UIF department has strong allegations of corruption against them, and that has to be dealt with. And then, of course, there were fraudulent claims submitted by individuals across the society, and all of those has to respond to. This is nearly part of the ecosystem in South Africa that we have to address. So we're mindful of the instances of corruption. We know all of our commitments to fight it, but it's not enough to just present those platitudes. What we have to do is to make sure that some people actually are prosecuted to the full extent of the law and that they end up in jail because of that. And so in the partnership that was forged out of these discussions, what we find is that we now have a more effective way to collaborate. This crisis has brought us together in a much more meaningful way. And what we're doing is to start to link supply and demand within the society and ensure that we develop the industrial capacity to respond to that. And my colleague Ross, who speaks later, will go into more detail about that. So the final points that I want to conclude on is that what we've got to do is to ensure that we operationalize the measures that have now been established, because there's amazing teachings and learnings out of that. We in the past have had similar efforts. The procurement accord, for example, that was signed in 2010, went a long way to achieve the similar conditions and environment that we have now, but I think we've made a lot more progress now. So the crisis has seen greater cooperation, but we still have to ensure that we undo the systemic blockages that exist in many of the areas. The advantage in PPEs is obvious, as will be explained in more detail, but it's that model that really is the cornerstone of what the master plans will represent in the future that holds the most promise for us. And already we've seen significant agreements in the auto, the sugar, the poultry, and the clothing industry, where master plans based on that principles of partnerships had significantly contributed to those sectors. There are more significant areas of the economy like agriculture, the oceans economy, steel, and the renewables, where there's a lot more opportunities, and that's areas that are underway and driven and supported by government. What do we want to do? We want to ensure that out of these processes, like we have with the PPEs and like we have with the master plans, that we're not only building value chains within South Africa, but we're plugging into global value chains, and especially stressing how to ensure that these value chains are able to promote the integration of the African continental free trade agreement that's being put in place. So all of these measures are taking us forward along the priorities that we've set for ourselves as a society, with a focus on the economy. And what we've got to do for the future, as I conclude, is to ensure that there's compliance, that there's clear regulations, and that the commitment to local procurement is something that endures, so that we have consistency, not only of supply, but consistency of demand that doesn't just respond to looking where the cheapest imports are possible from. These case studies in many respects have both represented our best ability to respond to challenges, but also key learnings on how do we build industrial capacity, grow the economy, and deal with the deficits of jobs and the responsible requirements that we have for the economy. Thank you very much for your attention. And can I now invite Ross Boy to present the next section? Thank you.
Great. Good afternoon, everyone, and thanks very much, Tony. Thanks very much to Borgo for setting the scene. So I'll focus my attention on the innovation workstream itself, and talk to really that coming together, and was, I guess, set in motion by Chris Griffiths, and I came in on the back of Chris moving on, but really, putting in place a work stream that was focused around the catalyzing of localization and manufacturing. I think Tim set out very well at the outset the challenge and the realities that we were facing, and a requirement to really look at how we were going to address the requirements for both PPE and medical equipment through local manufacturing. And I think there's a couple of areas where the stream really focused. The first one being accreditation. So just working with local manufacturers on acquiring the necessary certification, whether it was through SAHPRA, SABS, the NRCS, in order to deliver product that complied and was fit for usage from a, in the healthcare and a medical industry level. And the next part was testing. I think, the reality around both accreditation and testing was that, as a country, having not produced a significant amount of certainly medical grade PPE and medical equipment for some time, as already acknowledged in terms of where we found ourselves at, in March, that we needed to create not only the ability to manufacture, but also the ability to test and accredit to the necessary standards to be able to supply. And so there was a lot of work and a lot of interaction and partnership, if you will, and working closely with the likes of SABS and alternates through SANAS to get accredited labs and the ability for these products and suppliers to be tested. I mean, funding is always going to be a big part of that. We had the IDC, we had Project Last Mile, we had the Solidarity Fund, all engaged with assisting and guiding and giving insight and input into the ability to locally to fund these local manufacturers. And then, we put in place that capability and capacity around supplier and product vetting, really vetting their own companies, helping them to vet their products, using independent sources, ensuring the legitimacy, and just making sure that those, that vetting occurred. And then a big one, which takes me to that next block down, was around procurement. And really, one was assisting the manufacturers to get procurement ready, and ensuring that we were encouraging procurement from these local manufacturers that had been vetted. So I think a big part of that, if I can talk to that briefly, was of course a categorization of suppliers. So we talked earlier around 54 suppliers that have now been vetted up to category 1, and a category 1 is a fully accredited, ready to serve, procurement ready supplier. But behind that, we've got another 40 odd suppliers that are sitting in category 2 and 3, continuing on their journey to become fully accredited and be able to enter into the supply chain. So that structured process of accreditation then fed into the ability to access procurement and distribution. So that procurement element, of course, was initially set up through, the likes of B4SA Proudly South African and Tender and government, so that those suppliers and the funds that have been acquired, that have been donated either through the Solidarity Fund and other sources to acquire PPE and medical equipment were utilized, and were utilized not only on import and distributors, but on these local manufacturers, which was key. I'll jump up to the right there and just talk about the work streams and the substreams. So we had a broad stream, as I've described, but I think the substreams was where a lot of the magic happened. And I think the real reality was about staffing these work streams, offering both project management, strong project management, and analytical support. I've talked about assisting manufacturers with accreditation and funding, but I think the makeup of those work streams that focused on the 8 areas that you can see shown on the slide, from face shields all the way through sanitizers and medical consumables, was that you brought together a diverse range of skills out of different elements of the local manufacturing partnership that could then help to deliver effectively the category 1, 2, 3 suppliers that I talked about earlier. And I think what was so great about it when you look at what was done was you were bringing in engineers from Sasol, you were bringing in project managers from a number of the different consulting houses, you're bringing in the inputs from the team at SACTU, you were bringing in the team from the DTIC, and together those sub-work streams became highly effective and delivered within 4 months those 54 category 1 suppliers that are ready to serve. And obviously all of what I've described was effectively delivered by a partnership, the local manufacturing partnership that you've heard both Tebogo and Tony talk to. And I think the establishment of that partnership early in May 2020 with the primary objective to help local manufacturing companies produce PPE and medical devices, allowed us as a group to focus on understanding the gap between supply and demand, engaging together to build out those companies. And as Tony said, creating a cooperative model, which had a significant impact in terms of the speed and efficiency with which we are able to operate and get these manufacturers in a position to supply. So I'll touch on it again. I think that leveraging of the diversity of the partnership to both identify and address bottlenecks and then really drive through strong project management, combination of expertise, the ability to identify and unblock the bottlenecks and work directly with suppliers to get them and manufacturers to get them over the line was truly effective. I'm going to hand back to Tim now. I think we can, Tim, to take us into the next stage of the conversation in terms of the broader lessons learned.
Thank you very much, Rosh. I'm going to stop sharing the screen for a moment, and then we will move over onto the Q&A. If you have questions, please put them in the chat box and we will deal with those as best we can. For now, the slide that Julie is going to put up in a moment, we call this one a PhD in industrialization on one slide. So let me take you through. What are the lessons we've learned? Localization is possible, but what do we need? Capacity and capability. The lesson, we need to meet international standards. That means we have to consider intellectual property, procurement, and make sure there's alignment. There's no point in us procuring in South Africa a different standard or a range of different standards and not being able to test them from what the rest of the world needs. Partnerships, diversity and efficiency of those is a lesson learned. Access to capital and how to unlock it is, of course, something that needs to be dealt with. Lives and livelihoods, the flexibility of support that Tony spoke about. There is no one size fits all, and that too needs to be considered. Then we have to look at impact and how to scale that impact. And then there's a question about consistent demand for local and export. And that means commitments from the public and the private sector. I'm going to ask the participants, Tebogo, Tony and Ross, to please turn on your cameras as we segue to the Q&A session. Tebogo, I'm going to kick off with a question to you. Can you tell us from your perspective what the importance of partnerships in the supply chain are and how you get around the competition legislation that obviously doesn't want people to be subverting competition, but yet at the same time, we're saying in the supply chain, we want partnerships and communication. If you could tackle that for us, please.
Okay, so as I've said before, that localization is premised on partnerships. You can't draw a straight line and say it's government or business or labor. You manufacture for the country and obviously export opportunities. So you can't do that. Government can't. It's not a manufacturer. And business can manufacture without the support of various kinds from the government, including employment opportunities. Remember, what we are trying to do, besides providing health products, what we are trying to do is also contributing to the growth of the economy so that we create those opportunities. So a manner of instruments and supports are required. So I'm talking about financial and non-financial interventions, the role of regulatory institutions, including the Competition Commission. We know that there are rules that have to be followed. It is against the Competition Act to lessen competition in the economy. But there are guidelines on information exchange that have been published by the Competition Commission. It's not totally precluded, you know, for companies and role players to exchange information, provided, you know, there's no collusion. And I think section 4 of the Competition Act, as amended, deals with instances of prohibitive measures, you know. So there are procedures to be followed to ask for an exemption and condonation through the Competition Commission, making sure that, you know, in a situation like this, companies can meet to discuss market needs. Other sectors of the economy have approached the Competition Commission to ask for a condonation in various sectors, and I don't see what we are doing as being anti-competitive, because it's the government, business, and labor coming together and making sure that we are in a position to deliver on what is needed for the country and the economy, without necessarily transgressing the competition laws. Yeah. Thank you.
Can I ask you a follow-up question? In our discussions earlier, one of the things that you mentioned, you spoke about the Africa free trade, but particularly about the necessity to scale up. Could you expand on that, about what we need to do to scale up both demand and supply? So
what is important, obviously, around localization, as I've said, is that aggregate demand, it's key, all right? So I doubt if manufacturers and especially SMMEs will want to come into the market only to supply the government or some NGO or some schools, you know. So the demand in the economy from different sectors, that is mining, manufacturing companies themselves are procuring these products, including government, you know, and all spheres of government and state-owned companies. Those are critical, you know, as the total demand in South Africa is critical for us to drive localization. Manufacturing deals with scale, all right, and for therefore that scale is key for us to lower the cost of production, but also to scale up production. And as we know, South Africa, it's a country of how many? Close to 60 million people. And that is limited as compared to almost 1 billion in Africa. And that is why the trade agreement is key. Nature does not have a vacuum. So if one is not capturing the market, somebody will come in and capture the market and dump the product. So it is critical for our manufacturers to look at the opportunities in Africa. This is a global pandemic. Countries out there will have to provide PPEs. So we want, our president is heading the African Union currently, and has indicated, as I've said, that, you know, we will take a lead. So work has already begun in that area to make sure that we locate our manufacturers in different African countries, working through our embassies, and the list has been populated and shared with those embassies in terms of our capabilities. And that is key for us. Localization ultimately must lead to exportation, or the exports of the products, not only the demand in the home country. Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you. Tony, could I turn to you? You spoke about the importance of partnerships and the UIF and TERS. Could I ask you to explain how effective you believe the UIF TERS has been in sustaining jobs. And then as a follow-up to that, what other support is needed for partnerships like that to sustain themselves beyond this crisis?
Thanks very much for those questions. On the UIF TERS, I think the best indicator of its success is the fact that 50 billion rand and a bit of change has been distributed to workers who were displaced from their jobs as a direct result of COVID and the lockdown. The fact that we were able to put in place an institution, we weren't all happy with it, and we had to make adjustments to it, and a lot of the capacity from business and labor was brought to bear to support the Department of Labor to get the UIF system up and running. There was a number of call center provisions provided by sections of business to just support the initiative. And I think its success was only born out of the fact that everybody pulled together. They developed the architecture of what was required, set in place the parameters of the benefits that would accrue to different sectors of the society, and then ensure that it was effectively managed and executed. It was not without its challenges, but the challenges and even the instances of corruption are a small proportion of the actual amounts and the actual benefit that went into not only the economy and sustaining it, but also sustaining livelihoods and life opportunities for people. So that partnership that brought that about must clearly be appreciated for the significant contribution that it's made. What are the other steps that must be put in place to ensure that initiative from the partnership is given wings? Well, I try to make the point that if we look at PPE, it's a great example that Ross took us through, and the different measures that have been put in place and how we were able to start new businesses, create the supply for many of the requirements that was needed. And that was brought about by both harnessing the development finance institution, the banking sector, and also the existing industrial capacity in the country. So it's about making sure now that we've developed that demand, that it is there consistently. And this is where government's got to step in. It's got to make sure that the regulations support our drive for local procurement. It's got to make sure that many of the companies ensure that their procurements align to the capacity that we've developed, but also to the principle of us enhancing our local industrial capacity. The same would apply to government, because we've seen in many instances that procurement managers often look at where they can get the best kickback for themselves and are not overly concerned about the impact that the supply of that product has on developing industrial capacity, but also developing jobs and the economic opportunities that arise from that. So government's got to make sure, in conjunction with its partnership, that all the different elements that have been put in place, that's effectively and consistently applied. And if anything, we can now see the advantages that have not come out only from the PPEs, but also in some of the other master plans, the benefits to our society, and then to make sure that we're able to execute that effectively. If I can just make one closing point in respect where I think we need to do more to execute more effectively is in the credit extension scheme, where government put in place, made available 200 billion rand, and we've seen only around 16 billion of that taken up. In part because the banks have not been flexible enough to be able to support companies to a greater extent. Now, this is notwithstanding the point that Tebogo made earlier, that government had given them the flexibility to meet, to come together and find ways in which we can cooperate to better provide a service and support to the society during these trying times. So this is new territory for all of us. We made significant gains, but clearly we've got to employ some kind of pressure internally and in a collegial way to show that we all collaborate to achieve those objectives. Thank you.
Thank you, Tony. Ross, before I'm going to ask you a question before we deal with a few of the questions on the chat. What are the key differences in this PPE and localization efforts compared to others? What changed here?
Yeah,
localization has been on the agenda for a long time.
Absolutely, absolutely. And I think, you know, from a personal perspective, I've been involved in a number of localization initiatives, both in South Africa, on the continent, and funny enough, also in Asia. And I think there were a couple of things that changed here. And I touched on speed and efficiency, and I think we've talked a lot about partnership. I think one of the other, some of the other things that stand out here is that those that the people that got involved pretty much self-selected. So this was not this is my day job. This was, I am passionate, I'm willing to put my hand up, I'm willing to get engaged. And that came from all three partners. So your people who got involved really self-selected, and brought with them an immense amount of, I'd say, both social and political capital that they were able to leverage to move it forward. I think the focus around identifying and removing bottlenecks, having that combination of both the technical skills, I want to say commercial skills, and the capability when those were identified to engage with the right teams and the right people made a huge difference. And that came out of the diversity of the teams, I think. So, you know, one of my colleagues in this has also noted, and I think it's relevant, that, you know, unlike a number of other localization initiatives that have been very much within a structured and formal process, this didn't have that initially. And so you didn't see, regardless of who was in the team, it getting tied up in bureaucracy. It was all about getting things done and getting it across the line. And dare I say, it was, there was obviously an element of a crisis that helped to focus everyone. But so for me, those were a couple of the differences that for me have been identified. And I think the other key element was I think a recognition from everyone, all involved, that this was a national effort and crucial. Not only, it wasn't about the manufacturing sector, it was about an acknowledgement of what the country required. And it was easy to bring people to that, I guess, combined or central focus, which was, I think, a big part of why the partnership was successful. I think the reality is we managed to go from a standing start to accredited suppliers in 4 months. In other localization programs, similar activities have taken, can take up to, it can take years to get to the point where we, fully accredited suppliers who are able to supply and build up that capability. So yeah, I think it's significant, and I think there's just a number of components that I think I touched on that come together there. But it really also talks to some of the underlying. We talked about capacity and capability that does in the manufacturing side in sector. And Tony touched on it. I think where Labour played a key role was being able to identify which companies had perhaps the underlying capabilities and capacity to be able to supply and support PPE and medical equipment manufacture. In some cases, they hadn't done it, but just that acknowledgement of what was there and then putting the right technical capability alongside that was crucial. I mean, I think that's why, when we talk about where the local manufacturing partnership goes, Tim, we really have put a focus around, technical specialists. So really, focusing around those areas around accreditation and certification, continuous improvement and competitiveness. And then something that, I think we've all touched on, which is around demand creation facilitation, which is not only, which is at a public sector level, a private sector level, and export, and looking at the opportunities focused around, commitments, as Tony touched on, and ensuring that those are delivered against and those are met. And I think, those go hand in hand. And then the underlying piece is funding. There's no question, that coming together at both. I think what you're seeing here is at a more, if you like, an NPO, softer capital level, source and deployment. Be good to be able to match that or bring that together with both commercial capital to help these manufacturing businesses, particularly the strong ones, continue to grow.
So that actually, I think, leads very nicely into the first question that was asked by Dane. Ross, I'm going to ask you to keep talking, and then I'll bring in Tebogo and Tony to comment. Dane asks, are there any other needs that have been identified for local manufacturing? And he asks also about what funding is available for local manufacturing.
So thanks. I'll take a first stab at it, and then Tebogo and certainly Tony both be able to jump in here. I think one of the things, Dane, to answer your question, there's been a recognition that there are a number of areas where we have the opportunity. And I think South Africa is not unique in this, that there's been a real acknowledgement in terms of what globalization has done to local supply chains. And I think this really shone a spotlight on it. And so part of what I think Tony and Tebogo alluded to in terms of the lessons learned, in terms of, right, we have an opportunity, how to identify that next set. So that work is well underway, and there are other sectors. And perhaps I'll let Tebogo talk more to that. But I think just beyond even PPE, there's an acknowledgement that we can be doing more around medical consumables. So looking at the healthcare space more broadly beyond PPE and what could be done is something that is already, I think, underway coming out of this. And then we've got partners like the Manufacturing Circle, the Localization Technical Working Committee within BUSA, and already the discussions that I understand are being held at NEDLAC that are really seeking to say, right, what are the other opportunities to manufacture locally? So there's certainly a lot going on around that. And then your point about growing local economic growth instead of cheaper imports, I think Tony alluded to it in terms of not only the creation of jobs, but securing of jobs and building the right capability and capacity alongside that. And I think that also talks to where the local manufacturing partnership and the master plans that Tony talked to come into play. The other part is around funding available. I think, funny enough, what's become very clear is that there is a significant amount of funding available through different institutions. I think what has been highlighted through this is that a number of the companies that we engaged and worked with through this process have struggled to provide, in some cases, even the initial fundamentals around being ready for funding, whether that's grant funding or commercial funding. And so I think there's also, there's twofold. So in terms of funding available, between the IDC, CIFA, the likes of the NEF, the grant funding that came through Project Last Mile, Solidarity Fund is still, and that's been announced that will continue, and they will continue, and the fund will continue to play a role. And then you've also got, the different specialist SME funders through business partners, I guess, Spartan, the likes of Edge Growth, all focused around, funding local businesses and local capability. And now we've got a little bit of work to do. We found in the streams to help capacitate certain of the local businesses to access that funding by having the right initial due diligence documents in place. Personal level, I think there's still work to be done in terms of how we innovate around the funding of small and medium-sized enterprises in South Africa. But I think that's a much longer and broader conversation.
Perhaps just to round out on that question, if I could ask Tebogo and then Tony to talk about how they see the other manufactured products that could be manufactured locally. And funding, of course, if you have to add.
All right. Thank you again. Yeah. Well, let me explain the local content policy that the government is implementing. So what we have is that through the preferential procurement regulations is that other textile products, of which many of the PPE products are designated for local production in the public sector procurement system. So government departments are then forced to buy those products from local manufacturers. Obviously, withstanding the corruption that is there, but by law, they are not supposed to buy imported products because there are regulations actually forcing them to buy the products from South African manufacturers. So through this crisis, we have come up with instruction notes, through the National Treasury, informing government departments to do that, and some of the convictions that are happening now is because certain procurement officials bypassed those regulations. So I can name few products which require that. So your triple-ply surgical masks, your clothing, textile fabric related masks, and certain shoes, beds and mattress, those are supposed to be bought 100% in South Africa, meaning that they must be manufactured in the country. But we have also realized that there are other products which we do not have the 100% capability in the country, and we therefore have to either import the material itself or some of the products to meet the demand. So there's still a gap on disposable aprons, certain neutral gloves, goggles, coveralls, and certain components which make ventilators, tubes, oxygen masks, and hoods. So there is an opportunity there for local manufacturers to come in and close the gaps, because the capability is not fully developed. And you must remember that some of the products were not in high demand before the COVID. The demand for ventilators was not that much as we see now. And we have to come in through some of the motor manufacturers to shift from manufacturing components and to manufacture ventilators, and government provided the support for that. But as I've said, there are certain components which we are still importing, and that's an opportunity for SMMEs to come in and manufacture those products. The kind of support that we have, as Ross has said, there's different suite of funding from development finance institutions like the IDC, the NEF, the DTIC itself has the Manufacturing Competitive Enhancement program, the MSAP, which is an incentive given to manufacturers. I won't promise that there is money available, because some of the funding is oversubscribed. But we are not only talking about direct funding to the manufacturers. There's also a special approach through the special economic zones where, if you go and locate there and manufacture some of the products, government can come in through the support for infrastructure development within the SEZ. So yeah, as I've said, it's not only financial funding, but we have different kind of support, and some it's non-financial support, like testing, certification, and so forth, to make sure that we give the support to the SMMEs. Thank you.
Thank you, Tebogo. I'm going to move now to Jill Bogey's question, and Tony, if I could ask you to deal with that. There's quite a number of elements to it, but in summary, it's very interested in the partnership process and this manufacturing cooperation, the kinds of key challenges, the process of governance and control, what are the enablers of the process, and the lessons learned, which is very much the background, I think, the background slide, which will help guide us through that answer. Tony, if you could give us some of your experience in building those relationships and what your insights are.
Thank you. Yes, I think the relationships are, we're fortunate in South Africa in that we are a very well organized society. So you had Business Unity South Africa and B4SA, as their key representative in this engagement. And you have labor and government very centrally organized. So they're able to engage in discussions and forge agreements like they do in different sectors around wages and conditions of employment and so on. And because of their history and the practices, those agreements that are forged have both integrity and legitimacy, and they're generally able to form the basis of moving forward. And that's a key component. There's got to be the trust to build that agreements, and then the agreements has to serve a cross section of society. There can't only be one or two beneficiaries, so it's got to be in the national interest and out of there. So I think the fact and the way in which we've organized has largely facilitated that. We've seen a range of areas emerge that's a reflection of that partnership. But central to that always is government. And so if I can make a quick example, we have the new bid window coming out for renewable energies. That's going to create a lot of opportunities for different forms of renewables. So the entire value chain will have opportunities for new businesses to come in, to set up and to contribute towards the finished product. But to do that and to have the security of demand, government's got to step in to regulate that and ensure that, as Tebogo explained earlier, that some of those areas of the requirements are designated as sectors or products that must only be made in South Africa. So the regulatory environment is absolutely important, especially as we're supporting infant industries that are starting out in those sectors. If we don't do that carefully enough, we can actually undo what the intention is. So while the intention is to develop the industrial capacity, build the partnerships, and make sure that in this case, the end objective is more affordable and consistent supply of electricity, if we don't do that carefully enough with the photovoltaic and the wind energy that we want to generate, we could run into the same dangers that we did with the hot water cylinders, where because it wasn't sequenced carefully enough, we actually saw that we imported more of the hot water cylinders than the capacity we had before because there wasn't the protection for domestic industries. So I think we've learned a lot through the mistakes made in other industries. And if that is consistently applied going forward, there's going to be a lot of opportunities for people coming in different points into the value chain and setting up functional competitive sectors that can not only supply locally and onto the continent, but can also continue to supply globally. But for me, the key message out of any of the successes that we've seen is the basis of sustainable and credible partnerships that ensures that there's an outcome for the society as a whole. Thank you.
Thank you. Ross, I'm now going to bring you, and there's a question for you from Karen Skierpers about how did you manage to get government to respond during lockdown to accelerate accreditation, and how did we get that right with international standards? And then going forward, how sustainable are the 54 suppliers when demand for the products will drop? And I know Tebogo has touched on that earlier as well. If you could please give us your thoughts on that.
Sure. Thank you, Tim, and thanks, Karen, for the questions. I'll try and answer them relatively quickly. I think in terms of government response or the various accreditation agencies, if you will, to be honest, I think a big part of that was the leveraging of the network capital that existed in the stream, and the fact that you had the three different partners all very much engaged and leveraging that network capital. I think, to be honest, the acceleration in accreditation and the engagement directly with those accreditation agencies was the difference. The ability to bring in the right expertise to those conversations, a recognition from those agencies that they were there, that we were all in this together, and that it wasn't about anyone cutting corners, but about getting the local manufacturers into the testing process, clarity on what the testing process was, and ensuring open lines of communication to be able to move forward, I think was vital. And if I'm honest, I think there's still a lot of work to be done around that as we come out of it, because what became clear is that there are certain things that need to be addressed, and our colleagues in the DTIC already highlighted previously around legislation and around how local manufacturers are treated in terms of accreditation. Certainly they don't get any, it's not about getting preferential treatment, but they certainly are not moved to the front of the queue or get any kind of different treatment from anyone who's importing or bringing from offshore. And so there's some work to be done, I think, around accelerating that going forward. In terms of international standards, the reality is I think a lot of the focus was on complying with South African national standards at this point. And that's why we still have work to do around export to ensure that we align with and can work alongside both US standards and European standards, FDA approvals and the CE mark. So I think we still have work to do there as opposed to necessarily we have complied. And then the sustainability of the 54 suppliers. I think that's been a question from the outset. I think there was a focus on getting local capability and capacity up and running with companies that put themselves forward to be there. Of course, those 54 suppliers are spread across 8 different streams, with some streams having a lot more and some, as Teboho pointed out, where we're still battling to get suppliers to category 1 or battling or working to get suppliers to category 1. I think the reality around this, and this is something that I think we've got to acknowledge, ultimately with localization and the building of these local companies, and as particularly as we venture out into export, is that you are going to have to demonstrate as a local company that you can compete at a cost, quality, and delivery level with the best out there. If you can, you will continue to grow and develop and access investment. And if you can't, I think you're going to be in a fairly competitive, both local and international scene. But those that do come through, I think of the 54, those that do make it through and continue will create strong industry, stronger capability and capacity, and develop the necessary skills, both at a management and worker level, to be able to compete at a broader level. I think we've demonstrated that it can be done. Thanks, Tim.
Thank you, Ross. We are slightly over time. Thank you, everyone. I'm going to ask each of the participants just to give a final wrap, your final thoughts on the matter before we close for today. Teboho, if I could hand over to you, please.
Yeah, I think what is important for South Africa is that we must take the development of value chains seriously. Obviously, the exposure we had is that there is no linkage between supply chains or let me say manufacturing and buying in simple terms. And that was very clear in the public sector, that the information was not accurate, wrong decisions were made, in certain instances. So moving forward, if we really have to take localization seriously, we must link public procurement and to the value chains in South Africa. Is key for us. It's about expanding the tax base, so it's a self-feeding loop. If you support the local manufacturing, tax will come back to the fiscus. So that is key. And if we can get the private sector also buying, that will be much better. So this must continue and be extended to other sectors of the economy. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Teboho. Tony, final thoughts from Kusatu.
Thank you. I think what we need is a clear and consistent industrial development strategy, and all of the points that have been made feeds into that industrial development strategy in respect of value chains and the different components that we manufacture. But we've got to send a clear signal to industry, and we've got to be clear that these are providing us with an opportunity to not go back to what existed pre-COVID, but to do things in a new way. And some of the lessons that we've learned out of the PPE and other master plans have been really encouraging. And so it's about us building the partnerships and making sure that those deliver real value to the society. Thank you.
And Ross, a final word from you. Thank you, Tony.
Thanks, Tim. I think for me, it's kind of summed up in that first line that localization is possible, and an acknowledgement of what it takes and how effective partnership like this can be. Always, you want to hesitate to say, look, you require a crisis to make it happen, and it's this ability to take, as Tony has said, these lessons learned and apply them to other areas where there's a localization opportunity. Get away from, I guess, the bureaucracy or the maybe the areas that have held us back and the obstacles in the past, and really focus around how the different parties come together, but also bring those complementary skills. I think the biggest takeaway for me was the ability for these diverse teams to be built outside of a formal process, and then to get going and be able to deliver what has been delivered against PPE and medical equipment. I think if we can take those lessons, really capture them and learn from them, we've got an opportunity, responding to Dane's question, to look at those other areas and approach them differently and with more speed and efficiency, so that we can build that local capacity further. I think it's also highlighted that some of the underlying capability that exists in South Africa, as we know, is there. And it's about not only the identification, but really the kind of nurturing and building of that, both new and existing manufacturing capability. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Ross. Also, thank you very much to Julie Courtnage, who behind the scenes has put together this event and managed to corral all of us into one place. Her help and support has been invaluable. Thank you very much to the DTIC, to COSATU, to business. We have effectively a NEDLAC light here, and it has worked very well, I thought, perhaps proving that we are indeed stronger together. To everybody who has joined and asked questions, thank you so much. This recording will be available along with this presentation on the Business for South Africa website in due course. And with that, we can say goodbye. Have a good day.